and welcome to today's CID speaker series. My name is Sarah Luttrell, and I'm the Communications and Events Coordinator at the Center for International Development at Harvard. We're very excited for today's discussion on the transformation of the International Finance Corporation. The format for today's discussion will be about a 20-25 minute presentation as usual, and then we'll open up to Q&A with the audience, which will be about 10 to 15 minutes. Just a couple of housekeeping items. During the question and answer session, we ask that you either excuse me, raise your hand or in the chat box, ask your questions there. You can ask questions throughout the event, but we'll answer them at the end Q&A portion. We're also recording today's session, and this will be posted on CID's YouTube channel. So you can watch it after the event as well, or share with folks who might be interested. I will also be adding links in the chat to our social media channels and our website, so you can hear more about events like this. And our next CID speaker series will be with Shawn Cole. Shawn is the chief economist, the chief nutritionist at the U.S. Agency for International Development. So he'll be speaking on COVID and its impacts on nutrition globally. So we hope that you'll join us for that event as well.
Is that someone who has my name, or are you reading the wrong column?
I'm reading the wrong column. It's Shawn Baker. Shawn Baker, not Shawn Cole. I have Shawn Cole in my mind because Shawn is our moderator for today. Shawn is a professor in the finance unit at the Harvard Business School, where he teaches and conducts research on financial services and social enterprise and impact investing. So apologies, Shawn. So Shawn Cole is our moderator for today, so I will hand it over to him. Nutrition
is also very important. It's a real pleasure to be here and to introduce Philippe Le Houérou, who is the former CEO of the IFC. He served from 2016 to 2020, and the topic of his presentation is about transforming the organization. He led a $5.5 billion capital increase, convincing, for example, the US Congress to pony up under a Republican administration. Philippe has a long and illustrious career in finance and development, having worked at the World Bank, the EBRD, and several other institutions. And he's going to talk about what he's done, both to promote the investment capacity and the impact measurement and design. I have had the opportunity to work a little bit with him and with the IFC in a recent report they released on impact investing, and they are helping define the industry with their operating principles for impact management. As an MBA from Columbia and a PhD in economics from the Institut des Études Politiques, and it's a real pleasure to have him here. He'll talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. Feel free to shoot some questions into the chat, but we will then turn it into a discussion. Over to you, Philippe.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting, and thank you, Shawn, for this introduction. I don't know how much the audience knows about IFC, but let me go very quickly on that. IFC is the arm of the World Bank, that is of the World Bank Group, that works directly with the private sector. It was created in 1956 after IBRD and after IDA. But before MIGA, that's the kind of old institution within the World Bank Group. It has its own capital, its own board. We have a different shareholding than the World Bank. It's the same countries almost, but different shares. So that's very important for later on. And a very big difference between the World Bank and the IFC is the IFC lends without government guarantee. So it's a very different to lend to government, and I've done that in the World Bank for 27 years. Than to lend to a private company without any government guarantee. Very, very different. So one is the risk are completely different. The way we approach risk is very, very different. So the way I like to go over this presentation is to first start with the beginning, which is initial conditions. When you embark in a project, it's very important to understand where you start, where you are, where you come from, and what are the key issues. So I was I was in the bank for many years, and I was a VP in 2 regions. I was a VP for the IDA replenishment. I did 27 years, and then I left the bank and went to EBRD and came back because Jim Kim called me back to head IFC. Also, typically IFC has been headed for the last few years by commercial bankers from outside, not really kind of World Bank public sector types. So I arrived in March 2016. And the first thing that happened is that I discovered that the board, we have a sitting board, by the way. They sit 5 days a week, every day, and they review every project. They review every strategy, every policy. So it's a sitting board, again, very different from many other institutions with pros and cons. But anyway, the board was, the first thing, was extremely upset against IFC. And some had very tough comments on IFC. They were basically saying, now IFC at loss is sold. They are basically becoming a commercial bank. Why do we need another commercial bank? We have Mitsubishi Bank, we have JP Morgan, we have BNP Paribas. They're doing a great job. We don't need you anymore. So that's pretty tough when you arrive as a fresh new CEO. And the first thing, I was coming from London, and that's what I hear. So my first reaction was to take a ticket right back to EBRD, but it was too late. So I kind of tried to to understand better what was going on. And the board's view of IFC, first of all, they see every project, was also kind of underpinned by, we have an independent evaluation group inside the World Bank group that reports directly to the board. And they were showing that for the last 10 years, every year, the development impact of IFC in its project and advisory was going down from 80% to less than 45%, but permanent. So it was like a straight line. So it was not up and down. So development impact was going down. In parallel, the profitability of IFC in the last 10 years was going down. Not a very good, in fact, the truth is after 2008 crisis, profitability of IFC went down in parallel with the development impact. Very interesting. So the finance and the development impact were going in parallel downwards. At the same time, it's important to know there was the IDA 18 replenishment starting. A replenishment, IDA is the part of the World Bank that caters to the poor country. So it's part of the World Bank, they lend to government, but at subsidized rate. So it's 40 years, zero interest rate, etc. So every 3 years they have to do a replenishment because the more they lend, the more they lose. So that's the business model of IDA. And that was a launch of that. IBRD launched a capital increase. And IFC was still not clear whether we don't go for it. Also in 2015, also external context, there was this very important in the development community, a very important meeting in Addis Ababa called the Billions to Trillions. And I think it was very interesting because it was for the first time, it was hosted by the UN, that they recognized that the aid, official aid, were not going to grow. And yet the needs were in the trillions, and the ODA was 140 billion and was stagnating. So the billion to trillion was a way to say, hey, but there's a lot of money in the private sector. Why don't we tap into that? So that makes sense on the paper. The problem was how to do it. Another thing in the initial part of the initial conditions, it was 2016, which is exactly 60 years after the creation of IFC in 56. And since I love history, that was important, and you'll see that I used that. And then another thing that explains why the shareholders are not happy is the business of IFC in IDA countries. IDA countries is a short word, IDA, for poorest countries where the GDP per capita is lower than $1,200. And there IFC was stagnating. It was we're stuck at about 20-25% for a decade, and with no growth. So despite a lot of more resources being poured into the IDA. So clearly we had, and then another fact was that the population in IFC was going old. There was very few new recruitments. So a lot of the young were coming to IFC, got stuck in terms of career, and then living about 2-3 years with the stamp of IFC on their CV and finding much better jobs somewhere else, which is not good for an institution. When you grow older, it's not necessarily a very good sign of dynamism. So the first thing I did is I said, okay, well, let's let's have a diagnostic of where we are. And I deliberately decided not to take any consultant, no McKinsey, no BCG, nothing. I said just staff from IFC that are interested. And they come up after a few months with the big problem we have is we have no pipeline. And when you don't have a pipeline, that explains why your financial performance is not very good, because you cannot pick and choose if you don't have a lot of projects. So the staff, our IOs, investment officer, were fighting like crazy when they had the one project, even if it was not very good, because they had no pipeline. So that was one thing, and that's had a lot of implication. We had lost completely our sense of economics. There was no economists, or very few, and most of them were not even real economists. And they had zero power, absolutely no influence. They were just there to justify, expose whatever operation wanted. And then the equity performance. I said earlier that for 10 years, since 2008, let's say almost a decade, the financial performance was going down, and it was all linked to the equity performance. You know, IFC invests through lending, but also in equity and mezzanine. And the equity was very good. Between 2000 and 2008, IFC made a lot of money on equity, but after 2008, the returns and the performance was really not very good. But they continued to increase the share of equity in the annual commitments. So in fact, that explained a lot on the of the declining financial performance that I mentioned earlier. So that was basically the diagnostic. What to do? I launched a history book, 60 years of IFC. I thought it was important to know where you come from, which was a very nice way for me to very quickly understand the whole history. And you'll see that I use that later on. And very, very important, I needed a new strategy. Because the question was, IBRD is going for a capital increase. If IFC doesn't get a capital increase yet again, because IBRD had a couple of capital increase before and IFC didn't get anything. And that's important for many reasons, why, including one that a lot of people don't see. It's that the rating agencies, they rate, you know, your liquidity, they rate your a lot of stuff, including shareholder support. And the most obvious way to say that you have shareholder support is that they put more capital and that they finance your growth. So for me, it was very, very critical to make sure that IFC was part of this capital increase where IBRD was going way far and quick ahead, and we were basically not moving. So all this said, well, I need a new strategy. I cannot sell for a capital increase. You're selling something. So you can sell what you have and you want to do more of it. But what we had was not very good in 2016. So I needed a completely new strategy. And it took me about 6 months to do it. So in December of 2016, I came to the board. The guiding slogan was, I believe that slogans are nice to kind of capture the idea of what you were, the essence of what you're trying to do. The slogan was putting development at the heart of IFC and IFC at the heart of development. And with that, I came up with what I call the IFC 3.0. And the objective was to say we'll focus more and put more effort in the poorest countries. And that means in terms of region, Africa, South Asia, and the MENA. We will need to triple the size of IFC to match the World Bank. I came up with the whole story that, you know, if you want to walk on 2 legs, they have to have the same size. So the private sector has to be the same size as the public sector, so we can walk not with a very short leg in IFC and a long leg on the public side. So which means tripling the capacity to deliver in IFC. And but that has a lot of implication, because since we are stagnating, how do you increase? And especially, how do you increase in countries that are the poorest, the toughest, where corruption is high, where the truth is there is not a lot of projects, and that's where we're stagnating. So I changed a little bit the way to think, and I say, well, we have to move from reactive to proactive. What does that mean? That means instead of going to a country and trying to knock at the doors of clients and say, would you have a project for us? And then we decide yes or no, we finance it. We will be much more active. Instead of looking at the market as it is, we'll try to change the market, which means getting much more involved in policy dialogue and leveraging the World Bank that works with the government and can push and recommend some reforms on regulation, policies, you name it. And then part of this strategy was to say the bank has also to change, and they need to have a new approach to finance, especially in infrastructure, in agriculture. And I came up with this concept of cascade, really like a water cascade, a waterfall. And the idea was, instead of doing an airport and financing with scarce public resources, we can do it with private money without any government guarantee or minimum. So why don't you do that? And you keep the public resources to do the rural roads, because there's no private sector solution for that. Rural roads, it's not viable financially. But airports, ports, telecom, why is the World Bank, the public side, even implicated in that, except on the policy? But why do they finance projects? So why don't we have a cascade approach? And every time a minister of transport comes to the World Bank to say, I want a new airport, the staff of the bank should say, no, go talk to IFC. But that sounds very basic, but it's a revolution, because the first reflex of an e-task manager in the bank will say, great, I'll do the airport, no problem. I have IBRD money, I have IDA money, no problem. And then you add more debt on the book of the government, and usually they're badly managed after that. I have a friend of mine who tells the story of two airports, one in Amman, that is very well run and was financed by IFC, and another one somewhere else in the region that is publicly financed and real badly managed and losing money, where the first one was making money. That was before COVID. So the idea was, okay, we'll have also the cascade. So I was all of a sudden kind of going across to the World Bank to push them to do things different. At the same time, I told the board, as part of the strategy, I want to do more in poorest country, because that's where the poor are. But let's be serious. We need to de-risk some of these investments, because you want me to be financially sustainable. I cannot triangulate, except if I have some money to de-risk some of our investment, to change the risk-return equation. Every investment is about risk return. So at the same time, in 2016, when IDA was starting, the IDA replenishment negotiation, we pushed for having a private sector window of $2 billion from IDA. And that was basically to subsidize some of the deals, and or having a first loss guarantee types to de-risk or to reduce the price. That was not easy to sell to the IDA donors. Some were adamant that it was not a good thing to give money to the private sector. That's the way they saw it. But I can come back on that. We eventually made a good case. And part of it is IFC was paying $1 billion of net out of profits every 3 years to IDA. So it was an IDA contributor. And I told the board, I mean, we have to stop that, because this is double taxing, because already inside IFC, I'm cross-subsidizing the poor countries. I'm making more money in middle income countries, and de facto I subsidize the poor countries, because the RAROC, the risk-adjusted return on capital, is very low or negative in IDA countries. So I do already the cross-subsidization. So I'm taxed once, and now you tax me again. So we got rid of 1 billion every 3 years. That was a good thing. And we got the private sector window from IDA. It was useful that I did 2 IDA replenishment in my previous life on the bank side. So I knew all the donors and how the game is played for this replenishment. But I think it was a very good idea. The key issue there was to make sure that it was not a sweetener to to a deal. So you had to prove the externalities, the positive externalities. You have to prove that there's a market failure. So that's why I needed to staff up a lot in economics, which I did. Then another part of the strategy was to strengthen the partnership. I think today in the 21st century, you cannot work alone. IFC is not alone. We're not in 1956, where we're the only game in town. There's a lot of people trying to do what we're doing. So instead of all trying to do bits and pieces here and there, why don't we pull? So I know it sounds idealistic, but that was part of the thing that I wanted to do, and to establish IFC as setting the rule of the game. And I'll come back on that. And then finally, we told them as part of the strategy, we need more capital. I need to de-risk, but I need also more capital, because de-risking is not enough. I cannot do the volume without more capital. So the good news is that I got a very strong endorsement from the board and the president, Jim Kim, at the time. And we were back in the saddle on the capital increase discussion. So that so it was a very long negotiation. And in parallel, when you do all, so you put the strategy out, you negotiate the capital increase, but in parallel, you need to show to the shareholders that you're acting on the strategy, because they say, we love your strategy, but it's just a piece of paper. How do I know that your staff will follow you? How do I know that you can actually do it? How do I know that you have the stomach to do all the reforms necessary? So in parallel to the negotiation, I had to start changing things in IFC, and I did it bit by bit, and I tried to calibrate with, because at the same time you have to fly the plane and to do the business and changing at the same time. It's like rewiring a plane while flying. So it's a very interesting way of putting it, but it's very true. It feels exactly right. So I try to go now quickly on what did I do? How do we implement this strategy? And I'll break it in two things: one, organization, and two, organization and staffing, and two, the kind of new tools and the new approaches. So in terms of organization, the first thing I did was to create a VPU for economics. This is where Shawn was also interacting with after I had created it. So I brought someone from EBRD to head it. And because EBRD knew how to do impact quantification. They worked with Nick Stern on that when he was their chief economist, and I took Hans Peter that worked with him to head this department. I created a VPU, also a vice presidency for partnership to raise the profile, and then corporate services, where I wanted to align strategy, budget, HR, IT, all this into one vice presidency instead of bits and pieces that didn't talk to each other. The budget was not talking to the strategy guys were not talking to the HR to the budget. It was a bit of a uncoordinated. So by default, the CEO had to do all this. So I decided it's better to have a VP, and it was sending the signal we're serious. And then I reorganized the operation complex. And there the big thing was a shift towards the region. Because if you want to work more with the World Bank, you have to have something that is a bit similar to the World Bank. And the World Bank work by region. That's where, and if you want to be proactive, you need to be geographic. So the power in IFC was in the sectors, but it was very supply driven. So as a sector, I do line of credit. So they were supplying line of credit everywhere, whether it was part of the problem or not. So I wanted to change that and to push it, what Wolf and Son did, in fact, with the World Bank many years back, to shift the power towards the geography, towards the region. And then I put 3 VP, regional VPs that were matching 2 VPs each for the bank, which is very important because I wanted this to work better together. And a chief operating officer, because I wanted to have more time to negotiate and not deal with the daily business, except when there was a problem. And then diversity. So in terms of organization, it was, I set very high standards, and we increased dramatically on women managers. African was one of the toughest. I increased the number of African staff dramatically. In fact, we're lagging behind the World Bank, and now we're far ahead. And also background, but I'll come back. Also diversity of background.
And just to make sure we have enough time for the students to eventually jump in and ask some questions, maybe you could conclude by sort of talking about how you're measuring and quantifying success of this strategy.
Okay, well, that I will roll up the next two things. So thanks, Shawn. On the success, the first thing was we developed a lot of new approaches, including sector deep dive, country diagnostic, country strategy. Because if you want to be proactive, if you don't have a country strategy, it's very hard to be proactive. You have to know what you want to do, and that is the diagnostic. You need that, and the aim. We had ex-ante measurement of our impact at the same time. So we went to the board with both the internal rate of return, but also a measurement from 0 to 100 of the impact on the development impact of the project. It's called the M, anticipated impact measurement and monitoring, which, by the way, led to the investment principles, which was impact investing principles that we launched in 2019. So the outcome was we got the PSW from the IDA, 2 billion, and in 2017, and again last year we got another 2 billion as the new replenishment. We got the capital increase. We multiplied by 3 our paid-in capital. That was not that easy because the US and France were not on board. It took some time to convince them. But in exchange for that, you don't give a capital for nothing. We will increase our annual delivery from 20 billion of long-term finance to 48 billion in 2030, tripling the amount we give to we land and invest in IDA countries, and increase dramatically our climate change, the share of climate change project that we had. So that was a deal very quickly. I mentioned the outcome. The aim was a very big success. We reclaimed, thanks to the aim, part of the intellectual leadership that IFC used to have and using impact investment, because I believe that IFC was really, without knowing it, the first impact investors. But as the bourgeois gentilhomme, it was impact investor without knowing it. And then what I'm very proud of, but that I waited until I knew that the capital increase was in the bag. A huge workforce planning exercise where we did a big program to push out a lot of the old timers. That created a lot of space to recruit something that I feel very strongly, much younger people, but with a different background. More economists, more engineers, less MBA, sorry, Shawn. A lot of developers, people that actually know how to do a project.
Thank you, Philippe. So.
It's people that know how to do a project, not only how to finance it, more entrepreneurial, younger. And I put them in what I call upstream units, 260, from 0 to 260 in 6 months. So this, I think this massive recruitment was also very important, because one of the lessons I learned is, and I know that it's taught in business school everywhere in the world, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So changing the culture at the end of the day is changing the mindset. So you can convince people, but some will not be convinced because they just can't. They just can't. And then you need to bring a new perspective, but also new embodied in new people. So I'll stop here. I have so much other stuff to say, but I think it's better if we get into the question.
Yeah, my sense of knowing the students is they're certainly interested in measurement. We have a question, so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. We have a question from Kusi Hornberger. Would you like to pose that? You're muted, Kusi. Still muted. I'll pose it for you then. So basically, QC says, he feels you should be proud of your legacy at the IFC, but in his view, the use of blended finance or concessional financing to invest in smaller companies or less proven or higher risk enterprises remains subscale. So is this a high priority for the IFC? Should it be to figure out how to promote concessional financing and, I suppose, catalytic capital?
I think it is. I agree that it is a very dangerous game. I mean, we had huge internal debate. A lot of people were saying this is a slippery slope, which is true. And knowing IOs, I mean, they were using the concessional to, as I said quickly before, as a sweetener. So in other words, a deal that didn't need anything, but you know, because of the pressure for competition or whatever. And we ask a lot of things because we have a very strong environment, social and governance standards, and it's more costly for the investors. So so that was a temptation to use it. So that's why we created a whole governance around that. And in fact, we didn't use all the 2 billion that we got from the IDA private sector windows. And I am the responsible for it. I'm the one that negotiated it and the one that didn't deliver 2 billion. Why? Because I was super strict on how to use it. And we created a new, that was a governance issue, a new committee within IFC to vet the use of this concessional finance, because it's so for me, the ideal case is, let's say you have, it's a real case in the Philippines. You do a urban water management system and company. Now, you can do it on commercial terms, and you put a lot of rigor in management. But how do you go to the poor suburbs? Because then the return is very bad. So the use of concessional, and then you had huge positive externalities because clean water, the poor were paying Evian. They had to buy Evian. They had no money, but they had no access to clean water from the tap. So there was a huge health externality to give them clean water, but it made no sense commercially because they're not paying. So what then you can, there's a huge here, it's a win-win. You can bring some concessional money to go to the extra mile in the poorest part of town while keeping the benefit of a privately run company. So for me, the whole thing is based on the externalities. That's why I needed to strengthen the economic muscle in IFC. Because if not, if it is just the approach from an investment officer, it's just a sweetener. It's a financial transaction. And remember one thing. That's one thing that I discovered. It's the best way to do a good deal is to go to someone in an emerging market that has a monopoly. And you're destroying social value, but you're making money. So you're financially viable. So this economics thing had disappeared, and I came back with a lot of strength on the economics, because this is what makes the difference between a commercial bank that is going, they don't care if it is a monopoly, if there's social value or not. They make a transaction, they make money, that's good, and you know, the invisible hand is there to take care of everything else, that's fine. But not for an institution like IFC that has a public mandate, using private sector and private instruments. So that was, and the difference between the two is economics, microeconomics, macroeconomics. I can go on forever, but I don't know if it's a good answer to a very good question. But and the truth, and that would be the word of the end word for me, is the jury is still out. And that's why it was so tough on using it. And I had to give the money back to IDA. Everybody was screaming at me, everybody, and including, oh, but now we have another IDA, they will say you cannot use it. So I went to the IDA donors and I told them I returned the money, but I'd rather do that than misusing it. And in 2-3 years, we'll have an audit that will show that it was misused. And then you will cut us for something that is potentially can open up new territories. So it's a very, 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 very tough one, and contentious, but very tough. But we need economics. Without economics, you're lost on this one.
And now over to Karim.
Thank you very much for this presentation. My question is about the last point about the culture that you mentioned. Now you have these stuff which have developed a commercial banking mindset over years, and you want to change that to a developed mindset. Other than the new hires that you made, what are other effective tools that you used in order to do this mindset change? And how did it spread across the offices of IFC around the world? Thank you.
Very good question again. You know, Paul Kagame is the president of Rwanda, and we had a meeting one day, and he impressed me a lot. And he was talking about changing the mindset, and that is critical. But this is the hardest thing to do. And for him, after the civil war in Rwanda, it was also the toughest thing to do. And the way you do it is a mix: reward. The example that people work for the money, but they work also for the ego. And you know, the thing that you make little movies and you advertise, and we had great story about scaling solar. By the way, we had the proof of concept on this kind of be proactive, etc. With the scaling solar, that was a big success. A lot of advertisement internally on that, including with the president of the World Bank, the board, and then they hear the board very happy about it. So there is this feedback mechanism. You know, everybody wants to please the board, and for a good reason. I mean, they're the owners. So they was hearing very good thing from the thing. They were hearing the president of the World Bank being very happy, all the other multilaterals being very, very happy. This impact investing was a good thing, but the aim behind was also very important, because all of a sudden, staff had to think about what I'm doing exactly. Okay, there's a project, but the aim is capturing two things: the outcome of the project, but also the outcome of how is the project creating or deepening a market. And it can be any market, the stock market in Rwanda, I don't care. But it was measured. So all of a sudden they had to go through that. And then it started to change their mind. They started to think not only internal rate of return, NPVs, but also that. And they got used to it. I mean, they're very smart people. And yes, and I think this is a strength. I don't want to change completely the DNA of IFC. I mean, it's great to have an institution within the World Bank where you have people that know actually what is a mezzanine, that can structure a deal without a government guarantee, that know what is the debit and the credit. Most of the people in the World Bank don't. I mean, they are nutritionists, as we talked before. They can be veterinarian, there's a cement specialist, whatever. But it's good to have a place where you have people that hard-nosed finance. But this hard-nosed finance have to inject a dose of economics, and because that is the part of the mandate. They didn't sign for BNP Paribas. They signed from the World Bank, publicly owned. We are owned by 89 governments for a mandate that is a public mandate using the private sector. So you need these tools and this mindset of commercial, but a little bit more enlightened, if you want, than the narrow, just do the internal rate of return. I lend to a monopolist and I get my great profit and I'm promoted and life is good, because that's not development. So it's a mix, changing the people, bringing a lot of communication internally from all sides, and people read the newspapers. So when you see newspapers that say it's a good thing that, I mean, they kind of start to modify. And then this discussion internally on impact, by the way, one side benefit, another positive externality, was I saw that the quality of our papers to the board improved dramatically, because all of a sudden they were able to articulate what actually this project was doing for the economy, not only for the bottom line. So it's it takes, you have to, as Mitterrand said, you have to give time to time, but it's true. But meanwhile, you have to be proactive also and communicate.
Can we continue on this measurement thread a little bit and ask, you know, as you seek to draw the private sector in more and more to do this work, and I think a lot of asset owners who are moving towards sustainable and impact investing are doing it because they care about the impact. Where should we be headed in the next 5 or 10 years in terms of sort of high quality but not too cumbersome impact reporting that people can trust, maybe that's audited? What's your vision for what the private sector can do in the next decade?
Well, that's a very tough question, but I'll try my best to be to tell you a little what I was thinking at the time and where I am now. At the time, I was thinking that, okay, AIM, it's very sophisticated. Most asset manager will not have, this is a Ferrari. But okay, we have a mandate, we can have the luxury to have the Ferrari. But Ferrari is also important for the Peugeot, because you make a lot of new discovery in the Ferrari, in the Formula One race, that then you can translate to kind of mainstream everyday car, your Honda or your Peugeot or whatever. So I think that you need this kind of, and Harvard being a business school being implicated, the research, these are the kind of the front line, the Formula One, we need them. But I have no illusion that we need to little by little simplify and get from the Ferrari to the bicycle or to the four-wheel drive, to terrain. So, so that's why when we launched the impact principle, it was very general principles, which was, we didn't impose a methodology, because we know that the aim, there's no way many of those can do it. It's just too much work. But we learned a lot. And we told them, it's very simple. The principles is have a purpose, then manage for the purpose, then quantify the best you can, and then verify. Trust, quantify, but verify, because otherwise everybody, I mean, one of the things that triggered that is I saw in the newspaper, every week there was a new impact fund, but nobody was defining impact. So it was impact washing. I felt that it's like the danger of the green bonds. You know, you don't want green washing. So we had to put principles around the green bond. So the idea was, why don't we put these principles, but be flexible on the measurement? Everybody can, and there will be, everybody will learn and make mistakes. We learn from each other. And then and it's a kind of self-governing body. Maybe in 10 years, it will be part of the rating agencies. That will make an assessment, or there will be an external body that decide whether you are actually reporting correctly on the measurement of your impact. But that's a long way. I think that we are still in the first phase and crowding in more and more people. I know I may sound philosophy, but I'm French, so I cannot help it. But I do believe that this is critical for capitalism going forward. I mean, you cannot continue to have the divergence between poor and rich. And I'm not talking across the world. I'm talking within a country. I mean, you know, outside, I believe in downtown Washington, you have a village of tents outside. I mean, it's becoming like, how do you say in English? You know, the shanty town.
Yeah.
People are poor and it's freezing. And I know I don't want to sound like CNN, but it's true. And it's reflected in the long, like few decades where income disparity has increased. At the same time, you don't want to go back to experience in the socialism and communism that were total failure. So how do you reconcile the two? I'm not saying this is the magic bullet. I don't think there is one magic bullet. I think the government has to do different policies. But I do believe that the private sector has a responsibility, especially I'm not talking the mom and pop shops, I'm talking the large ones, to be socially responsible. And that means, and at one point you have to measure it to make sure there is no impact washing or responsibility washing.
So let me pose the last question, which I think is very relevant for some people in this audience. What advice would you have to a Kennedy School student who is thinking about making a career in the IFC or the World Bank?
Well, I'm biased since I spent 33 years between the World Bank, EBRD, and IFC. But I think, listen, I mean, it's a fantastic experience. I mean, I think that one of the missions that we don't talk about enough is part of our thing is to enlighten the world. As I know it sounds again a bit grandiloquent, but for that you have to be enlightened. And it's super interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to be able to straddle from policies to actual deals, back to policy, to research. You can have like a fantastic career within one institution. So you don't have to change your garage or your address. And then you have different lives within one. So it's quite amazing and unique. So for me, it has been mean, I could not have dreamed a better career, to be honest. And IFC is fascinating. I think, by the way, maybe I'll conclude here, Shawn, because I truly believe it. I was critical about IFC, but at the same time, I fought so hard because, you know, salary is the same when you're a bureaucrat. I mean, whatever you work on, it's the same. I worked very hard and pushed and took a lot of risk because I believe that IFC has the potential, private sector, to become a much bigger player in the development and architecture in the 21st century than it was in the last 60 years. Because we will need to tap into private solutions. So reconciling development and private tools, private mindset is one of the big challenges and potentially one of the key to the future of development and architecture. And the bank is a great platform for that because you have everything. You have MIGA, you have the guarantees, you have the project finance, you have the policy-based lending, you have we are in every country in the world. You have access, you have money, you have access, you have research, you have a lot of intellectual production. So I cannot imagine for a Kennedy school students something, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of exciting things, but this is one very exciting possibility. And then you can go back and forth. One thing that I will do differently. When I left for EBRD, it was because I was not happy with some reforms inside the bank at the time. But it's good also to move 2 or 3 different institutions because you see that everybody has this little thing. And I learned a lot in 1 year in EBRD because when you're inside only one institution, even if it's the largest one, there still are other more creative stuff being done somewhere else. So I think moving around is also important. And there's a lot more opportunities now than there was even 40 years ago. Right? 40 years ago, you had the World Bank and that's it. Now you have EBRD that didn't exist when I started. Very agile. And I talk about them because I know them, I work there. But you have a lot of very good regional development banks. You have, and you have the private sector. I mean, listen, I was a country manager in Madagascar at one point in my career. Madagascar, one of the poorest of the poor country, okay? So there was really, it was very tough. Now you have asset managers, pure private sector investing. So it's unbelievable. So the private sector has moved, has changed also. They become much more adventurous. They develop also the instruments to go with it. But even 20 years ago, it was unbelievable. So the private sector and this public-private, the real life is public-private, let's be honest. Even here in the United States, it's public-private. And this is one of the most capitalist country on earth, I think. And it's still, the public has a huge sway. And in countries that call themselves communists, there's a big private sector very thriving. So the truth is where you put the needle. And I think this World Bank group is a very good organization because in small you see all the different bits, public, private policy, public finance, public project, private projects. It's for me, it is a possible, extremely exciting career. But there are other places. I mean, I don't want to kind of, there's no monopoly left. And then maybe for the best.
Philippe, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with these students. We really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you all, and for making the time. Sorry I was too long, but
No.
I used to have the monopoly of the parole when you're a CEO, you know, nobody.
You're out of time. All right. Excellent.
Thank you all for joining, and we hope that you will be able to join us for the next CID Speaker Series event on Friday, February 26th with Shawn Baker, the Chief Nutritionist for USAID. So we look forward to seeing you then. And thank you again, Philippe, for that wonderful presentation. I know I personally learned a lot. And thank you, Shawn, for moderating and navigating that discussion.
My pleasure. Take care.
Thank you.